This happened in the 80s, before they shut all the mental hospitals down. The economy was bad, and I took the job because I was broke. The ad in the paper said, "Night security, no experience needed," and that was good enough for me. I didn't realize it was at the old psychiatric hospital until I showed up for the interview. Everyone in town knew about it, though no one liked to talk about it. It was the kind of place with a reputation. Something about how long it had been around, and the kinds of people who ended up there. I tried not to think about it too much. It was just a job. The guy who hired me was named Barnes. He looked tired in a way that felt permanent. He kept tapping his pen on the desk while I filled out the forms. "It's an easy gig," he said. "Walk the halls, check the locks, call if you see anything out of place. No weapons. You'll have a flashlight and a radio." I told him that was fine. He added something like, "Stay out of the East Wing, and if you hear anything strange, just radio it in. Don't investigate. You got it?" I didn't think much of it. The hospital was way bigger than I expected. The hallways all looked the same. Scuffed up linoleum floors, pale green walls, fluorescent lights. It was like working a maze, even with the "You Are Here" maps on all the walls. On my first night, I got a sense of the place. Most of the patients were locked in their rooms after dark, but you could still hear them, crying, yelling, or banging on the walls. I'd hear something behind me, turn around, and find nothing there. Barnes told me it was normal. "Ignore it," he said. "They're mostly catatonic." Some parts of the hospital were basically empty. The doors were locked, and it didn't look like anyone had been there in years. Those areas were worse than the wings with patients. They had this smell like stale air. The lights would flicker more often there too, but I figured it was just old wiring. One night, I passed by the East Wing, the one Barnes told me to avoid. I wasn't planning to go in, but I looked down the hall as I passed. It was pitch black, except for a single door at the far end. That one was wide open. I stood there for a second, staring, but nothing happened. I kept walking. By the end of my first week, I could tell the place had a bad vibe. My sleep got messed up. The job wasn't exactly hard, but it felt like it was getting under my skin. I started learning more about the hospital's history during my second week. It wasn't from the medical staff. Most of them didn't want to talk about it. But there was a maintenance guy named Carl who worked nights, and he liked to tell stories while he mopped the floors. He'd been there since the 60s. "This place used to be packed," Carl said one night. "They'd cram people in here, criminals, drunks, folks who just didn't fit anywhere else. And once you were in, you didn't leave. They'd keep you here until you died." I asked him if it was true about the lobotomies. He shrugged, like it wasn't even worth questioning. Lobotomies, shock therapy, experimental drugs, they tried it all. Some of the doctors thought they were doing good work. Some just liked having control. Lots of sick patients, but every once in a while, a sicko doctor too. Then he told me about the tunnels. Back in the day, they didn't want people seeing bodies being wheeled out. Bad for business, you know. So they built these tunnels under the hospital, used to connect to the morgue and the crematorium. You ever smell smoke in here? That's why. I didn't ask any more questions after that. It felt like he wanted to keep talking, but some of the details made my stomach turn. The more time I spent there, the more I noticed how much of the building seemed abandoned. Entire wings were sealed off. Sometimes, on my rounds, I'd see marks on the walls, scratch marks deep enough to gouge into the paint. The medical staff who worked nights didn't make me feel any better about being there. Most of them avoided eye contact, or just outright avoided me. The nurses kept their conversations short and professional, rarely chatting like you'd expect on a quiet shift. The doctors were worse. They moved with their heads down, barely looking up from their charts. I overheard one of them talking under his breath as he left a patient's room. I couldn't make out all of it, but I heard enough to catch the word curse. Another night, I passed a nurse standing in an empty hallway. She was staring at the floor, her hands shaking. I asked if she was okay, and she just nodded and walked off without saying a word. Things really started to go downhill after the new patient arrived. I didn't know much about him. Nobody did, or at least nobody was saying. He was in his late 40s, maybe early 50s, and was brought in late one night by a bunch of cops. They had him in shackles, the heavy kind you'd see in prison movies, and they looked like they couldn't get out of there fast enough. The nurses didn't say much either, just that he was special handling and was being put in the East Wing. That was all I needed to know to stay away. But even without seeing him, it was obvious something had shifted. It wasn't just me. People started getting sick. Headaches, nausea, fevers. Half the night staff called out over the course of a week. One of the nurses had a full-on breakdown in the middle of her shift. I saw her crying in the stairwell one night, her hands shaking so badly she could barely light a cigarette. Carl wasn't looking great either. He mentioned his chest had been hurting, but he waved it off as stress. Then he started missing shifts, which was unusual for him. It wasn't just the staff. The patients started acting out too. One of them, a guy in his 70s who'd always been quiet, started screaming at night. He kept saying someone was coming for him, that he didn't want to see the man in the dark. Another patient, who usually spent all day staring at the wall, suddenly refused to stay in her room. She'd clawed at the door until her fingers were bleeding, saying she couldn't be trapped in there with them. And then there was my mom. She called me to check in, and I noticed changes right away. It started with little things, forgetting what day it was, repeating herself in conversations. I thought maybe she was just tired or distracted. But one night, she called me, and she sounded scared, almost frantic. She said she hadn't been feeling right, that her memory was slipping. Then, out of nowhere, she asked me to quit my job. "There's something wrong with that place," she said. Her voice was shaking. "You have to leave." I asked her what she meant, but she didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke again, she said something that froze me. "He's watching you." I asked who she meant, but she just said, "Don't go back there," and hung up. The last straw for me came a few nights later. I was on my usual patrol when I passed the East Wing. I never liked walking by it, but I'd gotten used to the uneasy feeling that came with it. This time, though, something was different. The door at the end of the hallway was open. It was the same door I'd seen cracked open before, the one that should have been locked. I stopped and stared at it. The hallway was dark, but the emergency lights cast just enough of a glow for me to see inside. For a second, I thought I saw something move. Just a shadow, I told myself. Probably nothing. But then I heard it. A voice. Like it was right behind me. But it wasn't clear. Just a whisper. It was enough to make my stomach drop. It sounded like my name. I didn't go down the hall. I turned and walked back to the security desk, trying to ignore the feeling that someone, or something, was following me. After that night, I started avoiding the East Wing entirely. I didn't care if it made my rounds shorter, or if someone noticed. I just couldn't bring myself to go near it. The door at the end of that hallway stayed locked after that, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was a sign. Things at the hospital kept getting worse. More staff started calling in sick, and those who showed up looked like they were barely holding it together. Carl, who'd been a staple on the night shift, stopped showing up altogether. I overheard someone say he'd been admitted to the hospital after collapsing at home. A nurse I barely knew quit without notice after she fell down the stairs one night. They said she wasn't seriously hurt, but I saw her leave the building, and the look on her face said she wasn't coming back. My mom's condition was getting worse too. She started forgetting entire conversations and calling me in the middle of the night, confused and scared. She didn't always know where she was, and her sentences didn't make sense half the time. But there were moments when she was completely lucid, moments that felt worse than the confusion because of what she said. One night, she called me while I was at work, on the staff phone. Her voice was shaking as she told me she'd been seeing things in the house, shadows moving where there shouldn't be any. She said she felt like someone was standing in the room with her, but when she turned around, it was empty. "I don't think I'm losing my mind," she said. I didn't know what to say. I told her I'd come by the next morning to check on her, but before I could hang up, she started sobbing. The line went dead after that. That same night, I finally saw the new patient. It wasn't intentional. I was walking down one of the main corridors when two nurses wheeled him past me on a stretcher. He was strapped down, his wrists and ankles secured with leather restraints, but he didn't look like he was struggling. He didn't look much of anything, really. He was completely still, staring straight ahead, but his eyes, they were wrong. They weren't unfocused, like someone on medication. They were locked in, sharp and deliberate, like he was aware of everything happening around him. He didn't turn to look at me, but I swear he knew I was there. The two nurses pushing the stretcher didn't say a word to each other. Their faces were pale, and they moved quickly, like they were afraid to linger. The whole thing only lasted a few seconds, but it stuck with me long after they disappeared into the East Wing. That night, I started having nightmares. I'd be walking through the hospital, alone, and the hallways would stretch out in front of me, longer than they should have been. No matter which way I turned, I'd end up in the same place, standing in front of that door at the end of the East Wing. It was always open, just a crack, and there was always something on the other side. I could never see it, but I knew it was there, watching. I thought about quitting after that. Every time I walked into the hospital, it felt harder to stay. Between my mom's calls, the nightmares, and the way people were acting, I was on edge all the time. But I couldn't afford to leave. My rent was overdue, my car was still limping along, and there weren't a lot of jobs out there. So, I told myself I'd stick it out, just long enough to get back on my feet. The East Wing stayed locked, but I still avoided walking past it. The less I thought about what was in there, the better. Or at least, that's what I tried to tell myself. The hospital didn't make it easy, though. The patients were worse than ever, and there was a rash of incidents that no one wanted to talk about. One night, a man in his 30s attacked a nurse, clawing at her face and screaming about needing to get it off him. She wasn't seriously hurt, but the man had to be sedated, and I heard a few of the other nurses whispering that he'd never acted violent before. Another time, I found a patient standing in the middle of one of the common areas at 2 in the morning. He wasn't supposed to be out of his room, and when I approached him, he turned to me with this blank, almost dazed look. "He's hungry," the man said, and then he sat down on the floor and started sobbing. The staff weren't much better. More people quit, and those who stayed looked like they were barely holding it together. Barnes wasn't his usual self either. He was distracted all the time, pacing back and forth in the security office, or snapping at people over nothing. One night, I heard him talking to himself in the break room. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but his tone was sharp, like he was arguing with someone. Carl's absence was starting to feel like a bad omen. I asked one of the nurses if she'd heard anything about him, and she just shook her head. "He's not coming back," she said, but she didn't explain why. And then there was the new patient. I hadn't seen him again since the night they wheeled him into the East Wing, but it didn't feel like he was gone. It was like his presence bled into everything else. Patients were still screaming at night, still muttering about shadows and someone watching them. I wasn't sleeping much, and when I did, it was restless. One night, I woke up to the sound of my phone ringing. It was my mom again. She sounded worse than the last time we'd talked. Her voice was thin, almost like a whisper, and she kept forgetting what she'd already told me. She said she'd been seeing more shadows, and she swore they were moving closer. "It's him," she said. "He's not in the hospital anymore. He's here." I tried to calm her down, but I wasn't even convincing myself. When I told her I'd come by in the morning, she just said, "Don't let him follow you," and hung up. After a few months, it felt like the hospital, along with me and everyone in it, was coming apart at the seams. I avoided the East Wing completely. I didn't even walk near it. I stayed close to the security desk, trying to keep my head down, but it didn't matter. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. The same whisper I'd heard that night near the open door. My name. It came from somewhere behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty. The sound of my breathing filled the silence. I wanted to leave right then and there, walk out the door and never come back. But I couldn't. I needed the job. I needed the money. So I stayed, gripping my flashlight so tight my knuckles hurt, and waited for the shift to end. As soon as I got to my car, I sat there gripping the steering wheel, trying to catch my breath. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I told myself it was over. I was done. I wasn't going back in there, no matter what. But just as I reached for the ignition, I saw it. Through one of the windows on the second floor, there was someone wandering the hallway. A patient. I froze. My first thought was, they're not supposed to be out of their rooms. My second thought was worse. If they hurt themselves or someone else, it's on me. I could have left. I wanted to. But something in me wouldn't let it go. It was my responsibility. So I grabbed my flashlight, got out of the car, and went back inside. The hospital was silent when I walked in, except for the faint hum of the emergency lights. The hallway felt different, emptier somehow, like it wasn't the same place I'd just run out of. I made my way to the second floor, my footsteps echoing louder than they should have. I kept telling myself it would be quick. Find the patient, radio for help, and get out. When I reached the hallway, I saw her. She was standing at the far end, facing the wall, barely moving. I recognized her immediately. It was Mary. She'd been here longer than anyone else. Decades, they said. She didn't talk, didn't respond to questions, didn't interact with anyone. The only thing anyone knew about her was that she'd been locked up after burning her house down, with her family still inside. I called out to her, but she didn't turn around. She just kept standing there, swaying slightly, like she didn't even know I was there. I stepped into the hallway. As soon as I did, I heard a metallic click behind me. I turned around and saw the door had closed. The lock had snapped into place. Through the window in the door, I could see him, the new patient. He was standing there, staring at me with that same unnervingly sharp expression. And then, slowly, he smiled. I pounded on the glass, shouting for him to open the door, but he didn't move. He just raised a hand and pointed behind me. I turned back toward Mary, and that's when I saw it. She was holding a can of cleaning chemicals from the janitor's closet, one of the industrial ones with a bright red warning label. My flashlight caught the faint shimmer of liquid on her clothes as she poured it over herself, drenching her hospital gown. "No!" I shouted, running toward her. "Stop!" She didn't even flinch. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a lighter. I screamed at her to drop it, but it was too late. She flicked it once, twice, and then flames erupted across her body. The hallway lit up with fire, the heat hitting me like a wall. Mary didn't make a sound, but the rest of the hospital came alive. Screams erupted from every direction. Patients, staff, people I couldn't even see. Laughter mixed in with the screaming, high and manic, like the building itself was mocking me. The lights above flickered violently, casting everything in sharp, disorienting flashes. Through it all, I could still see him. The new patient was standing on the other side of the glass, watching me. He wasn't laughing or screaming like the others. He was calm, almost amused. He smiled again, raised a hand, and waved. I turned and ran. I don't even remember getting out of the hospital. 1 second I was pounding on the door, and the next I was outside, gasping for air. I ran to my car, my ears still ringing with the sound of screams and laughter. When I looked back at the building, it was dark. The lights had stopped flickering, and everything was silent again, like none of it had happened. I don't remember how long I ran, but eventually, I stopped in the parking lot, hunched over and gasping for air. My hands were shaking so badly, I dropped the flashlight. When I looked back at the hospital, flames were still visible through the second-floor windows. I should have just left. I wanted to, but I couldn't. Not yet. Someone had to call for help. I fumbled with the radio, which was still clipped to my belt, and somehow managed to get through to the fire department. They told me to stay put, that someone would be there soon. So I waited, standing in the cold, staring up at the building as the screaming died down. The fire trucks came first, their sirens echoing off the empty streets. Then the police showed up. I told them what I could, that there had been a fire, that a patient had set herself on fire in the hallway. I left out the part about the locked door and the new patient watching me. I wasn't ready to explain that. Once the fire was under control, they let me back in to walk through what was left of the hallway. The floor was soaked from the sprinklers, and the air was thick with smoke and the sickly sweet smell of something burned. The walls were blackened, but they told me the fire hadn't spread far. Just the one corridor. Mary was gone. What was left of her, they said, would take some time to sort out. I didn't want to think about it. Before I left, one of the officers asked me to confirm the location of the new patient. They were doing a head count and said there was some confusion about his whereabouts during the fire. When I walked back to his room, I half expected it to be empty, but it wasn't. He was there, sitting on the edge of his bed, like nothing had happened. The restraints were back in place, and he didn't even look at me when I entered the room. "Is this him?" the officer asked. I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. The patient didn't say a word, didn't move. But as I turned to leave, I felt him watching me. I glanced back just once, and that's when I saw it. The faintest hint of a smile, curling at the edges of his mouth. I quit the next day.